Welcome to the Elevating Consciousness, the podcast that helps you discover deeper levels of truth, meaning, and wholeness. I'm your host, Artem Zen, and today we have a special episode. It's special because it's our first episode, and also because we have someone here who has served as one of my major inspirations over the last couple of years. He is the author of Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha, a book that strips away all the nonsense from the meditative path. He's a master meditator, and unlike many other meditation practitioners and teachers, he's open about his attainments. He refers to himself as an Arhant, which in the Theravada Buddhist tradition is a fully enlightened being. He is an ex-ER physician and is currently researching how spiritual experiences can be integrated into the medical field. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Daniel M. Ingram. Welcome to the show. Super grateful to have you on.
Hey, well, delightful to be here. Thank you for that intro. I just want to start off with correcting one or two little things, if that's all right.
Please do.
So the first off is that when you use the word arhat, there's a lot of different ways that people define that, and the Theravada defines it various ways. Curiously enough, there are in all systems of where people define it, from the oldest to the most modern revisionist, which is my use of the term, and to the way the Mahayana refers to it, every system actually has levels of attainments beyond that. So all of them at least have Pratyeka Buddhas and Buddhas, and then other types of bodhisattvas. And so this actually does not meet the top of the hierarchy in basically any system I'm aware of. And it's also worth noting that I define it in a way that definitely annoys some traditionalists, right? So to be straight up about this, and by way of full disclosure, that they don't always like my definitions, but it's also worth knowing that the term has a long history of redefinition for various purposes. I at least go into very, very precise descriptions of what I mean by it. So if you're interested in that, you can check out, maybe we'll talk about some of that stuff, but in mctb.org. So that's just the first thing I wanted to mention there, because this stuff is controversial, actually. And as soon as you step out and start talking about attainments, it turns out there's a significant faction of people, some of which I really like Joseph Goldstein, et cetera. I like him as a person, but they find it aesthetically and karmically and all kinds of ways very unsavory to discuss attainments openly in any kind of way. And it's interesting. I was actually just up talking to Joseph Goldstein about this at his house for about 2.5 hours a few weeks ago. And it was interesting to hear his arguments, but just so you recognize that that there's that side, and then there's the other side of people who really appreciate it. They find it inspiring. It brings it down to earth. It makes it doable and workable and something more real. And so there's pros and cons to this. And so any way you play it, either being very silent about attainments or being very public and technically descriptive about them, or somewhere in between, sort of subtle hints and innuendos and fancy hats and titles, but not actually saying it, like that sort of gray zone in between, or giving empowerments that require a certain level of attainment or whatever, but not actually saying you have the attainment. So there's all these different ways to play it. And the politics of that can get really complicated and sometimes kind of nasty, right? So some people really vehemently, this offends them profoundly that I say these kinds of things, and they express their opinions in the public forum, and sometimes in private. And that's part of the rich dialogue that we're all trying to sort out, is what are the risks and benefits and alternatives of various approaches to even talking about attainments, right? Because any way you slice it, there's good and bad outcomes from anything we do in this world. And so that's been an interesting dialogue and ongoing discussion. So just sort of to bring that up, since there are a number of people who watching this will almost certainly be aware of these kinds of debates and these issues. But it's always heartening when people appreciate, the way that, for whatever reason, this Daniel is doing things. So based on its own conditioning and the universe unfolding as it does. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thanks for expanding on that. That was kind of that was pretty much one of the first other questions I was gonna bring up, is kind of how, historically many of the spiritual teachings have been like highly cryptic and ambiguous. And I think this is like the central problem that you address with your book, Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha. You do this by being like radically open and transparent, and by making the spiritual meditative path as practical as possible. And for me, this has been like a breath of fresh air. And for many others, you know, some other people, they haven't been too thrilled about this, like you're saying. So do you think that, you know, it's like the saying, those who say they are enlightened are not enlightened. Um, and Yeah, I'm just wondering, it's like, are they just stuck in like an old school mentality? And is this kind of like this transparency that's happening now? And like, to me, you're like the godfather of like pragmatic dharma, you know, like you're like the
There's
face
a
of that.
few of us,
A
right?
few,
There's a
yes,
few of
yes.
us who kind of made this thing the now sort of fringe but still semi-popular movement that it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it was a team effort, right? It's not, yeah. Anyway, but yeah. So yeah, so the pros and cons of this are very interesting, and the politics is interesting, and it's actually historically it's also really complicated. So clearly back in the day, the Buddha was constantly saying that people had various levels of attainment, and he, starting the whole thing, was very happy to talk about his level of attainment, and he had went and trained with people who had various jhanic abilities, who were known for their levels of attainment, and he was apparently happy to find these people that could explain that they knew how to do certain meditative things. So the Buddha also clearly benefited in his own training from people who would openly disclose that they could do various jhanic things and formless attainments and stuff like that. And basically, one of the first people the Buddha talked to that wasn't a giant snake god or another type of god, or was a wandering mendicant. And the first thing he said was to him was basically, when he asked what was the wandering mendicant looked at the Buddha and saw something was special about him, and the Buddha basically opened up in the most elaborate terms, and what his realization was one of the very first moves he did as a public presence. And then even later on, you find later on in the tradition, like, some of the Pali Canon texts were certified by 500 Arhats, or even later commentaries were signed by, the Arhat Upatissa signs the Vimudimagga. And so we see this complicated relationship to history, where on the other hand, there are also monastic laws that say you shouldn't be talking about this to lay people. You shouldn't publicly disclose your attainments except to other monks or nuns. But there isn't actually a similar law for lay people. But, and then the Buddha sometimes openly praised various, Sakadagamis and Anagamis, people with various path attainments who were lay people. And so it's complicated. And then you also see all the problems that causes. So as soon as you do this, people start criticizing you, they get angry, there's comparison, there's judgment, there's competition, there's doubt, there's maybe undue praise and projection of somebody being, unusually wonderful. Whereas, if you asked my wife about me, she would describe me in very ordinary terms because she lives with me on a day-to-day basis, which is very reasonable. And so, as soon as you do this, you open up this whole can of political and conceptual and psychological worms. And then actually Joseph Goldstein made this very interesting argument, which was an original one and one I hadn't heard before. And I had been getting arguments for me not talking about this for 20-ish years online. And so I give him an A+ for originality. And he said to me, well, Daniel, basically, if you're right, and you are in fact an Arhat, and you've correctly claimed this, that by being public about that, lots of people will criticize you. And somewhere in the old text, it mentions something about along the lines of people burning in hell in the next life if they insult an Arhat or something. He said, so you're basically condemning a lot of people to burn in hell, and you should know better. It's a very interesting argument. And then the other one, he said, but if you're wrong, then you're leading all these people to delusion. So there's no good way to play this. I think it misses some of the other positive benefits of just bringing it down to earth and making it feel like, a non-mythical thing from the far distant past that people could actually do. And so, so there's pros and cons all around, and just understand that the politics is very, very complicated. And there are other people who seem to very much have a heartfelt love of the myth itself, and to in any way sort of violate or bring the myth down to earth, they find profoundly offensive, because to them it's this incredibly meaningful thing, and that feels dirty or sullied or improper to them, because the myth itself has powerful cultural heart resonance for them. And so anything that kind of violates that sense that provides faith and inspiration, they find offensive. And so, but other people, on the other hand, are like, oh my golly, I could actually do this. And so just realize that anything you do in this world where light and dark contain one another and up and down reveal each other, and those kinds of things, as the Tao Te Ching says, is going to have very complicated effects, both pro and con. And at least by doing the experiment, we get to find out what that's like. So, so that's been interesting, if nothing else, from a knowledge gaining point of view. So is that interesting?
Yeah, for sure. I feel like there's a lot of truths, like partial truths in all those viewpoints. And like, this is like a complexity way of looking at this. And, I just kind of want to honor you for being willing to kind of take the heat, because it's like, you got to get on stage and like willing to take the heat for saying that. So it's like somebody had to do it, I feel like, and it was you. And what, there's negatives and positives, but like, in my experience, has been very positive to kind of see that, because I've been reading a lot of stuff and just like diving deep into like meditation and spirituality, and like your book was like the first thing, was like boom, it was like, okay, it's like, I'm reading the autobiography of a yogi, after having my crazy spiritual experiences, and I'm like reading this book, and it's like super out there, and I'm like, like, is this true? Is it not true? Like, how does this fit into my life? And then just reading something like, Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha really, it brings it back down to earth, and it kind of like bridges the gap.
Nice. Yeah, in terms of taking heat, I just wanted to say a little bit more about that. Like, I myself can throw around pretty powerful and sort of flaming rhetoric on the internet, and I'm doing a little less of that these days, if I can help it. And I started to realize that, like, we don't always understand the full consequences of what we cause in the world, and sometimes systems we're interacting with can be kind of unstable. So, for example, there are some people who decided that they didn't like me based on some anti-Daniel rhetoric that was around. And, I've gotten death threats and literally had to call sheriffs on people that had to go out and talk with people and see what was going on. And, people threatening to rape my wife and
wow.
Do terrible stuff like that. And so just recognize that it is a complicated world, and hopefully we will all play as nice with each other as we reasonably can. It's interesting, I myself have not always been so nice on the internet, and there are also lots and lots of people who think of themselves as very serious practitioners who also have not always been that nice. So maybe we can all, myself included, try to work on a little bit more right speech, as part of the Noble Eightfold Path. Just kind of throwing that out there, and I will do my best, realizing that I will make mistakes and not be perfect about this either. Take it for what it's worth. So yeah, there definitely can be a little bit of heat there, to put it gently. And you want to talk about your own journey? Because that was really interesting, you mentioning that. Do you want to talk about what happened to you? And
yeah,
that's always very interesting to me.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So let's segue there. I guess we'll just segue there, and we're gonna have to segue right into psychedelics, because that's kind of what happened for me.
Oh, a lot of people are getting into this stuff these days. At least a third of people I talk with now, psychedelics have been a major part of their openings and journey.
Yeah, so I guess this is very relevant, and this is relevant to your book also, because it helped me make sense of what I was going through. I've been meditating. I started using psychedelics, ayahuasca mushroom, for years, and then I ran into 5-MeO. I ran into this experience with the toad.
It gets a lot of high praise, right, from a lot of my dedicated meditator friends. It seems to sort of exist in its own category in some way. I don't mean to give an undue promotion to a psychedelic, but yeah.
It does. It's I don't think you could put it in a category. It's like, it's just a different thing. It's like a different, like you could use, mushrooms, ayahuasca, you could use, and then toad is just like, you're just going to a different level. So for me, really the first time I did it, it was just this huge experience, right? And now this is kind of gonna kind of tie in with the AMP from your book, The Arising and the Passing Away, because this is what kind of helped me make sense of what you call the arising and passing event. So like I have this big experience, it's like the most profound experience of my life, where it's like this complete ego dissolution, and there's like all this fear, and and it's just becoming this nothingness. And then out of this nothingness, like this immense compassion and unconditional love. And coming out of this experience, there's like a lot of tears, and it's very like paradoxical, because there's tears because you're sad, like all the suffering that's like unnecessary, and like this kind of conditioning, and like, this rat race we're in, stepping on each other's toes. And then also it's like beautiful, because you're like, oh, okay, like life is so simple, like it's about love. And like that's what the experience was like for me. But like when I had this experience, it was like, oh, like this is enlightenment, or like this is like, as I'm coming out of it, I'm like, wow, like this is what it felt like I was done, like I got it, like this is what life is about, like it's that kind of experience. And then as that fades away, you're like, all right, I got a taste of something, but I'm back in reality, and how do I work with this? And like, so your book kind of helped me make sense that, okay, this must have been you crossing the AMP, right? This must have been me crossing the arising and passing. This is the way I made sense of it. Because there's, multiple points that you said. Big experience. You mentioned that when people have these kind of experiences, they want to run and tell everyone about them. I felt I felt it possible to keep this to myself. I got to tell everybody about Toad. I felt like after this experience, I felt like my mind has been massively expanded. Everything became infinitely interesting and fascinating. I felt like I could understand things on a deeper level and from different perspectives. Coming out of this experience, I thought I was enlightened, and then also there was this very, very strong sense during the experience of no going back. It was like, okay, you're crossing over and there's no going back. And I never had that, like the other times when I did it, like the second and the third time, I never had it. But the first time I did it, there was this very, very clear, like no going back. And it was, yeah. And I feel that now. I feel that like I'm in a different place and I can't ever go back to the old me. It was a completely like death and rebirth experience. So yeah, I guess I'm just wondering, I think you mentioned that you've tried the 5-MeO.
I have not actually tried 5-MeO.
No.
So
Okay.
I've done ayahuasca one time in a ridiculously large dose in the jungle of Peru about, I don't know, how long was it ago? A while ago. It was like 18 years ago or something.
Oh, wow.
And it was 2003. Yeah. So 18 years. And back before it was as popular as it was. And it was, anyway, it was what it was. But yeah, I haven't actually done 5-MeO, though I've been invited to be a part of a 5-MeO study at Imperial College London with Chris Timmerman and the Imperial College London team, if I can figure out a COVID safe and tolerable way to get there, and if all that works out. So who knows if I'll actually end up being a part of that, but that's one of the things that's been discussed. But so, and a lot of my friends who have done this are like, they're all like, it'll be super interesting to see how you map this, which of the states and stages, and most of them don't really want to tell me which one they think I will say it is. My guess is it also kind of varies by the person. I actually get the sense that different people get different things out of it that all in some ways kind of sound the same, but functionally might be kind of different. So, and I've heard people compare it to the ANP. I've heard people compare it to dissolution. I've heard people compare it to some vast formless thing and nothingness, another perception or non-perception. Other people, and these are all people who already had some degree of realization, comparing it to cessation or fruition, depending on what you want to call it. And again, I haven't done it, so I don't know, but it'll be interesting to see. And the curious thing is, if I get to be part of the 5-MeO study, then we would actually get to compare that data to the fruition studies I was just doing at Harvard, which is a bunch of meditator and scanner studies at Martinos Medical Center, McLean Hospital in Harvard, where I was doing a bunch of fancy meditative gymnastics and an fMRI and EEG. And we would then get to actually see and compare, if I break through on the 5-MeO, like which of the things I did, because I was doing formless realms, I was doing ANP, I was doing fruitions, which of the things it most resembles. And then how that would apply to anybody else is anyone's guess. That's a single N, N of one study, basically. But those are the kinds of interesting things that we're pretty excited about, to try to figure out, how do these traditions relate? How do these experiences relate? How do the meditative and the psychedelic relate to each other, not only at a phenomenological level, but a neurophenomenological level, where, given some of the best toys we have for measuring things at the moment, what do these things look like? So that's the stuff that the EPRC and Emergence Benefactors, which supports it, are working to try to figure out, just to bring some more data and knowledge to this whole world. And as you mentioned, then better integrated into the clinical mainstream and public consciousness, and just have a less dogmatic, less orthodox, fixated, more data-driven, more clinical outcomes and, neurophysiology-driven discussion of what this stuff sort of is from a practical point of view, not really from a grand ontological point of view. Is this God? Is this the void? We're not that interested in those conversations. We're more interested in something just functional that would scale globally across a lot of religious traditions.
Yeah, I always have this kind of like thing in my head of like, there's like a thin line between psychosis and awakening. And it's actually,
for some people, that's true.
Yeah, it's interesting because my wife, she's a therapist, and she has her own practice, and and she was talking to one of her clinicians, like kind of about me, and like how, he's, he says like everything's like, this is an illusion, he says. And she was, and I'm open about like my psychedelic use, and she was saying, well, like he's having like a psychotic, like break from using from using psychedelics or whatever. And to me, it's like, I'm not, because I'm clearly able to function. But there's this kind of like disconnect of like people having these weird experiences where like, where do you put this? There's nowhere to put this. And it's just so easy to say, it's like, oh, this person is crazy.
Well, yeah. So the boxes that the mainstream medical clinical world have been given that they can put things in are incredibly narrow. And the history of how those boxes arose is actually fascinating. And there's an excellent PhD thesis by Dr. Brian Spittles that's going to be coming out as a book on Eon Books that you can still download online for free. Now there's a PDF, 2018 Psychosis and Spirituality, Brian Spittles, Spittles. You'll find it as a PDF. And it actually talks about how we got here in a situation where incredibly important experiences that for the rest of human history had generally had some religious or spiritual attribution put on them, and sometimes sense of religious and spiritual value, even if sometimes they look quite weird. If you read the lives of the Catholic saints, for example, they're usually pretty complicated, and the politics around them usually in their lifetime was quite complicated. And a lot of them we would just diagnose today from a clinical mainstream limited point of view, given the boxes that the clinical mainstream has been given, as just being crazy. But that clearly is not the whole story. And as plenty of us who went to medical school, I had already had a bunch of very powerful experiences when I got to my second year of medical school. And we were being taught the standard criteria for psychosis and schizophrenia and bipolar and delusional disorder and adjustment disorder and schizotypal personality disorder. And there were a bunch of my friends who, through psychedelics or meditation or just spontaneous experiences in their own life, had gotten into some of this territory. We were looking at these a little uncomfortably going, there's no option here for us. When we were highly functional people in the top third of our class, generally in a second of 5-tier medical school, doing quite well, and we all went on to become successful, clinicians and families and and contributing to society in reasonable ways, despite the fact that we intentionally had cultivated a lot of these experiences and counted them among the most meaningful, profound, transformative, and valuable of our entire lives. And so that was about 20 years ago for me now, 21 years ago or so, when I was in second year medical school. And such began my dual life of being, on the one hand, where I'm helping all of these people, get into some very powerful experiences, and also dealing with the sometimes very destabilizing and frustratingly challenging nature of some of those experiences that people had gotten into through various ways, going on retreats in various traditions, taking psychedelics to spontaneous experiences, a wide range of how they got into this stuff. But and also recognizing that the way we dealt with all of this stuff is still in the realm of expert opinion. So we have no large clinical outcome studies based on different management strategies for different categories of potentially challenging or existentially disrupting or openings or energetic things or kundalini stuff or awakenings or dark nights or whatever you want to call this stuff. Pick your favorite maps you overlay on this. And it's also worth knowing that all of us who map this stuff, nearly all of us endlessly fight with each other about the maps. So it's funny, like all these well-meaning people can suddenly get very pissy about exactly what this term means or that term means. We need some kind of clinical we need a broad enough taxonomy where we're not trying to force all this stuff into single ancient terms. We need to expand out our terminological lexicon to embrace this range and a number of different approaches and ways of looking at this. Right now, we're all like, sort of pissing matches over what the A and P means and stuff. It's really childish of all of us, but hopefully with some good science and some good medical linguistics people and some good discussions, we can come up with terms that are more broad to help people map these things in an expansile, inclusive taxonomy that has hopefully some neurobiochemical meanings and some predictors of clinical outcome stuff and all of that is much more extensive and broad than the unbelievably, painfully limited categories that are currently offered in the DSM, ICD-10 and 11 billing codes out of the WHO and other systems. So I don't there's some Latin American and Chinese and Russian, et cetera, versions of some of these systems. And I don't really like any of them either. Which is to say they have substantial room for improvement in ways that I think can really add value to care. So I think clinicians globally would really benefit from some better, more nuanced frameworks. And I think patients would also. And I think patients would be a lot happier with their care if there was some room for nuance, that all of this stuff wasn't just pathological, which we know personally it isn't. I know for certain it isn't. And hundreds of friends and people I've talked with about this stuff and thousands of posts I've read online. I know for certain this stuff can lead to tremendous benefit when it goes right and is managed well, though it can also cause problems also. And so that's, again, the emergence benefactors in the EPRC is trying to raise the few $100 million and find the hundreds of researchers and build the bridges to often contentious communities to see where our common ground is and to see what we can get together on and see just what helps people. Because I think a lot of times we're certain we know what helps people and we're certain our tradition is the best at helping people or our way of describing stuff is the best at helping people when I'm almost certain it isn't. I think just like mixed martial arts, I've used this analogy in some other podcasts, right? Just like mixed martial arts, Taekwondo thought it was the best and Muay Thai was the best and Kung Fu was the best and all that. And Capoeira was the best. No, none of them were the best. No, mixed martial arts is the best. And it took pragmatically from basically all these traditions and combined them into something just better that just leads to, and I think for the peaceful arts, we can learn some wisdom from this analogy and think about how we can all be a little more humble and a little more willing to put our stuff up to a little more scrutiny and a little less orthodoxy and see what comes out of it. I think it's highly probable that a lot of the terms that I love in my spiritual world will not make it into final products and policy recommendations. A lot of the conceptual frameworks probably won't. And we'll just, all of us who are doing this have our favorites that we love, that helped us, that made a difference. But for this project, we're going to probably have nearly all of us are going to have to let nearly all of that go and see what actually can just scale clinically and is well demonstrated by the science and what drops out of the studies and the phenomenology and robustly is demonstrated again to meaningful diagnostic categories, et cetera. Sorry, that was kind of a long discussion, but it's a topic I'm passionate about. And I think all of us, so this is a call for all of us to do better, including me, and just do something that really helps people globally in the same way that chemistry or physics got over some of their pissing matches and just decided, no, this is what we call things and this is what we do because it just makes good sense. I think we can do that too with a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, this is, super interesting. I'm fascinated with language and communication, and this is kind of this is something I wanted to speak about because I think terms are so important in the meditative and spiritual world. And it reminds me of this idea in communication that we can be agreeing externally, right? Like we could think that we're agreeing externally, but inside we actually mean different things. And in a similar way, we could be disagreeing externally, but inside we mean the same thing. And then it's kind of like the language, like it gets lost in the language.
Yep, there's a lot of that. And there's also something in religious scholarship called the narcissism of small differences. And, it's kind of like the Baptist convention of 1860 something versus the Baptist convention of 1870 something or whatever. I don't know, but those years are right. I'm just sort of winging it here. But like they might really disagree fundamentally, even though if you put them on a taxonomy tree of religions, they would be so close as to be nearly indistinguishable to all outsiders. I think that a lot of us fall prey to this on a regular basis and miss the bigger picture of just helping people. And so I'm trying to remind myself and trying to set a good example these days when I possibly can that, hey, let's try to do a little better than that and really just keep our eye on the prize. Because I think most of us who are into this stuff think, having felt the power of this for ourselves in various ways, however we describe it, and we go, wow, there's a there, and I'm better, and this is important, and this could, and then we start thinking things like this could change the planet, this could change politics, this could make people more peaceful or less violent, or, reduce carbon footprint or save the planet or whatever, just lead to a better society and better neighborhoods and better outcomes globally. And if we think that's true, that some version of this, from some sort of perennialist point of view, or something like a perennialist point of view, is important, then we need to be thinking about how to not have an adversarial healthcare system, right? That really just has no good options for any of the experiences we consider the most important, except bad ones, and no good treatments except expensive meds. And so that's what inspires me these days, to try to figure out how we can keep our eyes on the prize of what we agree on and what will help people. Because while we focus on our disagreements, they will be endless. As the Buddha said, people with opinions just go around bothering one another. And I think nearly all of us in the meditative world have demonstrated the degree to which we're proving him right. We are demonstrating the truth of the Buddhist Dharma by going around bothering one another. So anyway, being a living example of the truth of his words.
So what do you think is the term if there was one term that's the most fought about and disagreed on in the meditative and spiritual world, what is that term?
Yeah, I think it's awakening, right? What in the world does that mean? Or enlightenment, or pick your favorite version, or synonym, the term's specific synonym for that. Yeah, it's so interesting to watch the endless discussions we can all somehow get sucked into if we're not paying attention or being careful about exactly what that is. And it's kind of like we just have a few words when really phenomenologically we might describe different things. So imagine if you had two cars, and you were just like, well, which one's a car? And like one was a this brand and one was a that brand, one was a Ford and one was a Chevy. I'm down here in Alabama, and you got your Ford people and your Chevy people, and you said, which one's a truck? Well, no, they're both trucks, kids. It's just, and so the problem is truck is too limited a word. You need more differentiating words like Ford and Chevy. This is a Ford, this is a Chevy, right? And so, but the problem is that people can kind of miss that, and we can lack that basic, and a lot of people, at heart of hearts, we've been so touched by the traditions that we want, no, this Ford is the truck, this Chevy is the truck, right? No, like, yeah. And I understand the love and the faith that this comes from, and how moved we've been by the beauty of the language of the traditions we came up in, or the people who helped us. I get that. I feel that. And yet somehow I think we need to be more terminologically sophisticated and have a more expansive taxonomy that really reflects the specific phenomenology and criteria of what each of these things are, rather than, and I even do this with the word Arhat, right? So like, but at least I carefully define it, but it's the same problem. So I'm as guilty of this as anybody. And really, we need more sophisticated language that breaks this out and gets us out of this kind of academic term domination pettiness and into the realm of something that, again, would be more helpful from a global point of view.
Yeah, so the car thing made me it's like the true self and the no self debate, and I kind of like how Shinzen he's like realizing the primordial perfection. It's like realizing that you're nothing that is everything. So it's like this paradoxical notion that it transcends. Was there some pushback on that? Because I sense. Please.
That's a classic example. Go ahead.
Yeah. Just to me, it's like it seems like because the experience is in a lot of ways is ineffable. So as soon as you start putting language onto it, it kind of starts breaking down. So I'm actually wondering how, you know, going forward, how do we decide which terms to use? Do we have, you know, do we survey people that have these experiences and then see what words people use? And then we see like, because this kind of reminds me, I don't know if you're, you probably are, considering that your website is Integrated Daniel, but, psychological development, like integral theory and basically developmental psychology. And a lot of that was based on, especially like Susan Kagruder's work with ego development. A lot of that is based on language. So the way that they group people into these stages is seeing what language they use. So to me, it's like people could have 5-MeO, and I've kind of noticed this with other people. And I'm like, I don't know if we had the same experience. In general, people seem to have like this, it's like this God realization experience, it's God molecule, whatever. But a lot of times, like, I'll talk to people and they're just kind of like, yeah, it was like a lot of crazy stuff was happening. And I'm like, you're not able to like put it in words, or you're not able to find any meaning or significance, or at least I'm not able to gauge that from you the way you share. So I'm just wondering, like, people being at different stages can use different words, because that's kind of where they're at.
Okay, so there's a lot in there. So there's there's the raw phenomenology, and most people are relatively terrible phenomenologists for even simple things, as anybody who's attempted to do phenomenology notices, much less really far out there complicated things. And sorting out what is their descriptive term that is very neutral or whatever from what is their sort of interpretive or diagnostic overlay is also incredibly challenging unless you ask a whole lot of questions about exactly what those words mean and try to get it down to as raw sense data as we can, realizing the senses are not that raw as they come to us. They're kind of pre-processed. And even interpretation can do funny things with our senses. So, for example, I woke up one night and it was about 3 a.m, and I was certain there was gunfire because I heard this. And my brain, the first thing it thought of it was gunfire, because people fire guns out here in the country a lot, but usually not at 3 a.m. And it was so regular. It was like, and that was how my brain, it just sounded exactly like gunfire, because that was the first interpretation. So I got up out of my bed and I walked into the living room, walked out on the front porch, and I couldn't hear it out there. And I was like, okay, wait a second, this is weird. So I walked back into the bedroom and it was my wife breathing. She was going, but my brain had its first interpretation was so certain it was gunfire somehow. That was like, and then I literally heard it differently the instant I saw her. Like literally the sound changed in my brain. So the constructivist people are not entirely wrong, right? There's something to the constructivists. And then we get into the whole constructivist versus essentialist debate. There was some sound. It wasn't that there was no sound, I don't think, and my brain was entirely interpretive. But there was something, literally, I watched the sound itself change and the image around the sound change in my brain the instant I saw its source. And so I was like, okay, so this is really complicated. So then you get into even more advanced questions of, well, okay, which interpretation is better and leads to a better outcome? Well, clearly me thinking this is gunfire versus my wife snoring, or not really snoring, just sort of breathing loudly. Was that's a better interpretation, right? Because then suddenly I'm not all paranoid and afraid someone's firing a gun in my neighborhood at 3 a.m, which would be weird, and all of that stuff. So I think it's a more functional interpretation. And so then we get into odd questions like practical ontology, like if you give people explanations for what things are or certain language for what things are, do they have better outcomes? And this is what the traditions have actually been sort of pissing amongst each other and debating and exploring for years. Is it better if you call it true self? Is it better if you call it no self? What are the psychological and functional implications of maybe you're taking something that someone could interpret kind of either way, and even that's debated, and like which conceptual overlays in specific cultural contexts or even for specific people may lead to better outcomes. And this is really complicated because, like, as Ajahn Chah once said, he said, I'll give one instruction to one person and someone else will hear it and go, well, wait a second, that doesn't sound right. And Ajahn Chah would say, like, well, no, they're on this side of the path and I'm trying to get them back to the center. You're on the other side of the path. And I would say something almost directly opposite to you to get you back to the center, right? And so even that gets complicated. And so this is not simple. Anybody who's been in this world long enough realizes this is not simple. But that said, like functionally, so questions of like, super abstract experience is exactly where there's also the question of you could look at them functionally. So a lot of people take psychedelics and it doesn't change their life that much, which is a weird thing for people who have had a psychedelic experience change their life profoundly. So I've had a lot of people who said, oh my God, I did whatever, and I had this incredible experience, which I would likely label the arising and passing away or equanimity or something. I don't know. I'd put it in my boxes. It doesn't mean they're the right boxes, right? So, but I would mentally label it a certain way. And they would go to all their friends, oh my God, you've got to do, I did 5 grams of mushrooms and this happened to me. And then they give it to a bunch of their friends and they go up and they come down and they're like, well, yeah, that was really weird and powerful, but they didn't change anything. And the person who had this experience is like, wait, why didn't it didn't land, it didn't click. Even if they might have described the weirdness in pretty similar terms. So you've not only got the phenomenology to deal with, you've got the functional outcomes of that phenomenology, which is not all the same. And why it seems to be one way for one person and one way for another, we don't know yet. But everybody who's been doing this long enough has observed that, right? And why all of a sudden one person is like super loving and like it just opens up their heart. And another person who describes some powerful experience is suddenly like super renunciate. And they're like, all of my life is meaningless. I'm just going to go practice for a year, and live in a cave in the jungle or whatever, and so that's the other interesting thing is even if their phenomenology they describe may be really different, the way it hits them and the functional outcomes, which are really what most people care about, I think most of the time, like how did my life go after that? Those can vary quite widely, even with very similar phenomenology. So I think the taxonomy has to include not only phenomenological categories, but outcome categories, right? And what in the short, medium, and long term did these things seem to lead to? And then, because those might, even for very similar phenomenology, require very different types of language and types of approaches and things to get the good outcomes that the patients themselves and maybe family and society, depending, who's, and healthcare systems and et cetera, whose criteria for good outcomes you want to incorporate, thinks, oh, that was a good outcome, right? So even what a good outcome is can vary widely. Like, did it save healthcare dollars? That's what a healthcare system thinks about. Did it keep people off precious beds? Did I not have to give these people $300 a month meds for the rest of their life? That's what healthcare systems care about. And then like families may care about it. Like, why can't you make them back like they were? Like, that's what a family might care about, and then the person themselves might be like, wow, now how do I help the world with this? Sorry, this is not simple, right? And we're recognizing this is not simple, but still, I think, sorry, I've been talking a while, but really simple things like if someone's having powerful shaking and energy moving in their body, or kundalini, as I might label it, someone might label it a conversion experience or some variant of a peak experience, or opening trauma centers or sankaras breaking open. There's all kinds of ways to language this, right? But if someone's having that and it's really bothering them or causing them some trouble, regardless of how you language it, there may be kind of moves that again and again demonstrate that they can get people to not be trembling all day long from their weird energetic opening or whatever it is. And so there may be things we can agree on functionally, even if we don't all agree on what to call it. But we are going to have to, for textbooks and stuff, write about something, and we're going to have to probably describe it very clinically. But somehow for diagnostic categories, we are going to need some language. And that language is going to have to be very, very neutral to not piss off all the religious traditions that all want their own special language on it. And we do that all the time, right? So like in medicine, we have our technical lexicon of words we might use to describe something. So for example, I might say to my doctor friend, oh, he had an erythematous rash. The rest of the world would hear red. Because erythematous just means red. So we come up with these weird fancy names that somehow we, either are alienating to people or maybe have some descriptive utility. I don't know. But so there will be the technical lexicon that is the medical specialty. And then there will be the way each culture and society has their own vernacular for it, or local term for whatever also, which is also what happens today anyway.
Yeah, it seems like a very complex process.
This is a complex project, which is why I think it's going to take about 30 years at least and a whole lot of money. Because everybody
Yeah.
who's ever attempted this before has failed. So
You know,
we don't, there's not a good track record of success ahead of us. But
uh-huh.
we think this is a good time to try it for a lot of reasons.
Yeah, you know what's fascinating that you mentioned this is, and I noticed this too, is people taking 5 grams of mushrooms. You know, two people take 5 grams of mushrooms and it impacts them completely differently. You know,
Yep.
I've read, for example, one of the things is the microbiome and just the way that the enzymes break it down for certain
Sure.
people. For some people, it just doesn't hit them the same. That's why taking it like intravenously is actually like you can measure it a lot more because you bypass that process of going through the stomach. But I'm just curious. I'm very fascinated. What is it that's happening? What is this pivotal moment? And it seems based on your descriptions like the no going back, it's the arising and passing away. But like, what happens to somebody that they start meditating 2 hours a day, or they want to go on a Vipassana 10-day retreat, or they're just like not like the relative reality is just not doing it for them. They're just they know that they're on that. What is this? Is this the arising and passing away?
Well, that's what I call it, and other people
So
call
can
it
you?
other things. And other
Yeah.
people like really don't like that definition. So, for example, some of my traditional Theravada friends that have very, very narrow definitions of it, that they feel like the last textbook that was allowed to say anything about this was the Visuddhimagga. You know, that this old book, from about 1500 years ago was the last word and will be the last word till the end of time on what these stages are and how they're defined. And they don't like it when those of us who are modern phenomenologists lend our own broad, more perennialist, inclusive language on this. But other people really appreciate the functional descriptiveness of that, because a lot of different things that may not all fit with the very limited descriptions in this book may lead to similar functional outcomes. That sort of zealousness, inspiration, dark night following, change of philosophical ability, cognitive ability, heart open, whatever, like
Mm-hmm.
this broad category that I call the A and P,
Yes.
functionally, so it's interesting. We're probably going to need more language and more terms for that, and different terms, so it's not coming out of one religious tradition, even though arising and passing away is a pretty neutral bit of language as these things go. But like, what is it? And it depends on what you mean. Like, from a clinical point of view, like without knowing the physiology, it seems like the onset of spiritual puberty. Like, to me, that's kind
Yeah.
of how I think of it. It's kind of like a puberty that not everybody starts, right?
Yeah.
Because all of a sudden you're in this new awkward phase of new emotions and perceptions and feelings, and just in the same kind of way that puberty is. Like,
Yeah.
like teenagers are different. People who've had adolescence hit are just different emotionally, physiologically, perceptually, even cognitively. They may be kind of different, and certainly in terms of the role in society, we recognize them as different, and legally they're kind of different in some ways as well, and so in some places depending. And so, like, to me, it's kind of that, but it's a weird one, because it can happen to people when they're super young or super old, or it can happen in all these different circumstances. Although the traditionalists hate that, right? They say no, this specific insight can only happen in this specific tradition. That specific insight only applies to that specific tradition. I think that kind of thinking is not going to scale clinically very well, because I think there's got to be some pretty similar, if not identical, underlying physiology. That's just my medical guess. But in terms of what it is from like a neurobiochemical point of view, we have no clue.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody knows. Like, nobody's captured this stuff with enough imaging or enough sophisticated measurement to get a sense of what it is biologically.
Yeah.
But one of the things we actually want to do as part of the EPRC project, the Emergent Phenomenology Research Consortium, one of the sort of crowning jewel projects in our hat, if we can pull it off, is something called the Emergence Research Center, where we would actually have a fully functioning retreat center where people could come and do a range of practices, in pretty high dose, and then have an fMRI with 24/7 techs and EEG and other biochemical measurement, wet lab, epigenetic, et cetera, capabilities, and qualitative and quantitative research of biometrics and how these people describe stuff, and cognitive testing, and all the stuff you would need from a lot of angles, kind of all the angles we have. and then, long-term follow-up of these people to see what happens to them out in society after they've had these experiences, and also comparative to get a sense of how each of the traditions are diagnosing this and managing this, and to then compare those outcomes. And to see, hey, they thought about it this way, they conceptualized it this way, they used this language for it this way, they did these techniques this way, they framed it this way, this is how they modified diet or practice or sleep or exercise or whatever they did, or gave different instructions or the same instructions or whatever, and then just see how that impacts the world. How does that, and in a few months, in a few years, whatever, how does that lead to different outcomes in people's lives, and hopefully do that on a big enough scale to actually get robust data that then we can get a sense of kind of what this is from a number of measurement points of view. For everything from linguistic and perceptual and cognitive and sociological and, occupational and relational but also physiological and all of those things, to the degree that we can measure those now, and hopefully with better measurement technologies being developed in the future to help us with that. So that's the dream. So if any of you out there have an idea of how we can get, I think, the $50 million or so to make that happen and finally answer these fundamental perennial questions that have dogged religions and caused endless sectarian pissing matches for thousands of years, I think we actually now have an ability to get a sense of what these things are in at least more functional, clinical, biochemical terms. Not that that's going to be the end of the story. And plenty of people who say, well, you can't measure consciousness. You can't know what these things are at that deep sort of consciousness, can't see it from the sense doors, fundamental ontological level. And they may be right. But I think functionally and clinically, what is the role of pharmacology? What are various management and cultivation strategies and all of those kinds of things? That I think we can know something about, even if it's definitely not the whole picture.
Yeah. So I kind of want to circle back around, and I see how terms can be problematic, and like depending on who you're giving the teachings to, depending where they're at, you would say it in a different way.
Oh,
but
yeah.
I'm very interested, for people that are just beginning, and I talk about these things with some of my friends, and most of my friends don't meditate at all, and it's like all of this awakening and meditating, like why would you meditate stuff is just beyond them.
Well,
and
yeah, it's because from my point of view, spiritual puberty hasn't hit them yet, and it might not, which is fine. Like I think we in society need stable people who are not on this weird ride. I think they're very, very important. I don't know that we want everybody to be undergoing, profound existential transformations. Some people are like, everybody just needs to wake up. And I'm just like, I don't know about that. Like maybe if we have better support structures for that process, or better global, awareness of the possibilities of what can happen and how to handle that. But like, do we want everybody suddenly radically, skittering off in radically different directions? I don't know. Maybe.
Yeah. So let's circle back around to everybody waking up, because I'm interested about that also. But how would you define awakening? Like if you could just, in the most like introductory way, just to kind of open somebody's eyes to it, like how would you define it?
Okay, and realize this is just one dude on the internet's opinion, by way of full disclosure, right?
One meditation master, yeah,
or and even people debate that. There's some articles in Mindfulness that literally say I literally know nothing about meditation or jhanas or the stages of insight, by a scholastic monk who says that, I think in 2 articles, something like that.
Yeah, I'm familiar with some of that.
That
stuff. That's fine.
So just recognize there's a range of opinion on this, Daniel, like by way of, okay, fine.
We're listening to you though. We're
today.
We're on the
stage.
Okay, yeah.
Right. So the way I think about it is that, there are levels of sensate clarity that help put things in a high degree of perspective. And what that perspective from a sensate point of view, from an immediate empirical point of view, in the sense of like David Hume empiricism, not like, well, it's also sort of scientifically reproducible, but that the way I actually explain this a lot to people is do the following experiment. So if you're listening to this and you don't really have a sense of what this is, we're just going to do an experiment to kind of get a sense of what this is like. Okay, so if y'all will join me in a kind of little exercise, I think this will help in a way that my rambling about it probably wouldn't. So here we go. Everybody just close your eyes and think of something that inspires powerful emotions in you. And something that's not going to be too triggering if you've got trauma and that could be very painful or cause problems, don't pick that one. But just something that inspires some reasonably powerful emotions in you, that by bringing that to mind, you're going to feel something in your body. You're going to feel the physical effects of that. So we'll just go ahead and do that for a few seconds, and I'm just going to be quiet here while you bring up something that's going to cause some thoughts or images, of future or past, that are going to cause some reaction in your body. Okay? Now go ahead and feel what that's doing, and feel how big the thoughts feel. Feel how much of your experience the thoughts feel like. Feel how they can, for a lot of people, feel very strong. The thought loops, the images, the phrases or tape loops of auditory stuff in your mind that you've felt a lot. And now open your eyes and try to keep that going. The thoughts and the feelings about that, but you're going to bring in the room into your experience. You're not going to have your eyes kind of go up to the side like you'd check out to check your calendar. You're going to be there in front of your screen, in your chair or in your car, or taking your walk or whatever you're doing, in the space you're in, with the sights, the sounds, all immediate, all very clear. And you're going to notice that there's a sensate component to your thoughts that is a very small portion of your experience now. It's not that it's not there. It's not that it's not important or relevant, but that the thoughts of past or future are actually images and colors and little sounds and stuff that occur now in this space as a very small portion of it. Try to figure out what portion of those thoughts it is in terms of the sights and sounds around you, of the body around you. How loud are the sounds of your thoughts in comparison to the sounds of whatever sound, the air conditioner or the birds or the road or wherever you are. If there's other things going on in the room, how loud is actually the sound of your thoughts? What portion of that experience is that? What portion of the room are those physical sensations in your body? So of all of your experience, what portion of your body are those feelings in your stomach or your throat or wherever the sensations showed up? What portion of the room you're in or wherever you are, the outdoor space, etc., is that? And if you're like me, you'll notice that suddenly it's way harder to do the thing you could do with your eyes closed. What are these thoughts? To simultaneously hold those in the same space, the thoughts have vastly less power. The emotional, physical feelings in the body are a very small portion of your total experience now. It's not that they don't exist and occur and convey their messages in some important way that, was, from an evolutionary point of view, probably designed to defend the mammal and lead to good survival outcomes or whatever. But those sensations in the body are a very small portion of the room, not even 1% probably if you looked at volumetrically. And the thoughts are very small, wispy little things that, again, you can hear. You can hear what they're doing. And the images, you can get a sense of what those images are about. But in comparison to the visuals of the room you're in, they're really small parts. This is not spiritual bypassing, because the clarity is still there about all those sensations. They're part of experience, and an important one, that you get messages and intuitions and the ability to plan and navigate and remember and do all that stuff. And, hopefully have, but the proportionality of it and the sensate clarity about all the thoughts of past and future just occurring now as little wispy things in a vast space of experience, that's kind of what it's like. And so just keep going in that direction, more and more of that. And that, from my point of view, is what awakening is about, and kind of locking that in so that becomes much more the default, or that applies to many more layers of our psychological, emotional, perceptual makeup, and that eventually is the only game in town. That literally you're always in the present moment in some kind of way. And even if there's a thought of past or future, which can convey functional information about an imagined future or a remembered past, it's still automatically known to be occurring now. So that's the awakening to the clarity of sensate experience with regard to thoughts, with regard to feelings, with regard to states of mind, with regard to the body and the sense doors. That's all your foundations of mindfulness right there. And so waking up to that and not being able to be lost in the same kind of way where when you start off the experiment and closed your eyes, it's very easy for the room to tune out, the body to tune out, and to still have the optionality of that if you wanted to get into formless realms or whatever, or you want to do deep cognitive work. But to have less and less of the mind's tendency to get caught in that or lost in that or fooled by the images it's creating of a remembered past or an imagined future, and to have it then cause all the powerful emotions that it does when thoughts are much bigger and the default mode network is really activated and you're not really there in the room or the space in a really, except in a kind of barely functional way. Right. And so hopefully that for yourself gives you a sense of when I'm talking about awakening, that's what I'm talking about. And you can read all the fancy technical details, but this is something I think people, at any level of spiritual practice should be able to relate to. And I think it's a reasonable definition that doesn't get too woo-woo and too whatever, but it's just something you can functionally operationalize. And then it leads to very straightforward things. Well, you can just train yourself to be more present to thoughts and experiences and emotions and states of mind and sense stores. And by training that wiring, you can be more here, more present, more awake. And so this is just a learnable skill like anything. As anybody who's done mindfulness training will notice, wow, I was just way more present to the thoughts and feelings I was having, and just keep going with that. It just turns out the levels to which that can be taken and the degree to which it can be hardwired into one's experience. And then just there for you, reliably there for you, is something that helps moderate emotions and helps bring clarity to thoughts when they're occurring, and just makes you able to tune into the body and the space you're in and the people in front of you that you're talking with and what they look like and sound like and feel like and all that. So that's how I would define it, if that's helpful.
You had I think it was in your book. I don't know if this is exactly how you said it, but it was kind of very simple. It was it's awakening is knowing perspective without a sense of a perceiver. It was something along those lines.
So eventually, it's funny, scientific materialism actually leads to this. So scientific materialism says these are all images in a meat brain somewhere, that the red you see is not actually the real red, that the thoughts are all just imagined in a meat brain somewhere. And this is basically all like the holodeck for old Star Trek geeks, or like a three-dimensional screen for those who have no idea what that means. And it's just like a three-dimensional screen in a meat brain somewhere. This is literally what scientific materialism says, that all of this is just the image. And the image just happens to include all our sense modalities and thoughts and meanings and all of that, but that none of these are actually the real thing. What's curious about that then is like you can actually notice that the red pixels on my screen here are not observing the microphone, right? They're just red pixels on the screen, and this is the microphone. The microphone is not observing the red pixels on the screen. Each of these are just there where they are. Well, it turns out that's true for all the stuff on this side as well. All the mental impressions and intentions and everything are just like the microphone or the red pixels on the screen or the sounds in the room or the meaning microphone. The meanings can also occur on the pixels on the three-dimensional screen. And so the notion that any of these are actually special and privileged and stable and somehow outside of causality really just doesn't make any sense, right? It's all causal. It's all aware of itself where it is, and the mental impressions and the intentions just arise naturally. There's not a true doer. The mental impressions are just, follow the thing. So to get a sense of what I mean by mental impressions, like look at your screen, if you're watching this on a screen and not listening to it, or just look at something, close your eyes, and then pull up your memory of that and compare the experience of the memory that was the quick mental impression that was made that you can then pull up again as your functional sort of shorthand for the experience. Compare the memory to the screen and then open your eyes and look at the screen again. You'll notice these look nothing alike. And you'll notice the mental impression that was made of the screen that you could then remember happened shortly after looking at the screen. So you must have been able to be aware of the screen without the mental impression, because you can even understand what I'm talking about. And so it turns out mental impressions are not a true observer or a true knower. They're just something in the way the system seems to function that allows you to do things like remember and operate on things you just experienced conceptually. And the same with intentions. We think intentions are a true doer, a true agent. But if you start to get to know the intentions that precede things, like I have an intention to say something, and that thing was an intention that I was holding before it actually became the word thing. Well, it turns out that intention arises just like weather arises. And so just in the same way as all of this arises very naturally, which is weirdly enough what science tells us. And so it's not surprising we would be extrapolating similar things from our experience. And so those are also aspects of awakening to the degree that to which those are just obvious in real time at baseline without needing a lot of reflection or work. That also are aspects of awakening from my point of view. And again, people define this differently. And so that's fine. We just probably all need our own terms, right? So for what these things mean. It's funny, in the world I live in, to sort this out, some people have come up with this term technical fourth path, which is sort of talking about like that to compare it with other various definitions of what that might mean, all of which may have their utility in certain settings. So
yes. So I think some of some people push back on, this idea that there's full enlightenment or full awakening, or like you're either awakened or not. So I'm wondering, can awakening be seen as a spectrum, maybe like of like letting go, right? It's like somebody has just let go more and somebody has let go less.
sure, right, and this is the same with jhanas as well. Like these sort of terms we use to describe these advanced, meditative stages of concentration, these temporary blissful states, or rapturous, or expansive, or tranquil, or formless, or whatever states where. And people, there are two ways to think about these things, and I think both can be useful in various contexts. So there's categorical thinking, which is black, white, yes, no, is, isn't. This is jhana, this isn't jhana. This is awakening, this isn't awakening. And you just draw a hard line in the sand. There are conversations for which, however you draw that line, where it can be useful. And there are practitioners, when they come to me with their experience, where that kind of language can be very, very helpful. And really, they are just suddenly shifting from one very defined state to another very defined state with very precise criteria and hard lines. And that's what's going on for them. And then other people, I use very dimensional language for jhanas in particular, and also for awakening sometimes. Where like you have more or less seclusion from hindrances, more or less bliss, more or less tranquility, more or less silence of mind, more or less mental stability, more or less exclusiveness of attention. And so you can kind of be describing with a high degree of nuance that still allows a person to recognize what degree of jhanic factors they've cultivated, give that some validity, and then allow them, if they wish or can, to cultivate more, or to then start to organically drift away from those factors to whatever the next thing is in some way that doesn't have those hard lines and hard shifts. And so I think for different practitioners, and the same with awakening, that's why I proposed the simple model, which is basically it's very dimensional to the degree to which on some, hard to make numeric scale, you have understood these things functionally in your experience to whatever degree, to whatever amount of the time, to whatever depth, to whatever degree of completeness, et cetera. Those are aspects of awakening. And so I think we all, again, need to get better about recognizing these two styles of description in our own minds and in our own practices of categorical versus dimensional, recognizing that each may do different things functionally, and there are risks, benefits, and alternatives to each of those ways. When you use categorical language, you piss off a lot of people that may feel it invalidates their experience. But when you use categorical language, it may also be super descriptive and helpful for changes that really do seem to have threshold effects. And there's a line before and after, like you're like, you're in your own description, some categorical language, regardless of what it is, really seems to apply to that 5-MeO experience, that one, not the other two, for you. There's a line, there's before and after, and you feel that. So categorical language kind of really works for that. Whereas for like the other two experiences, maybe dimensional languages works. There were this degree of formless, or this degree of confusing, or abstract, or profound, right? But maybe not quite as profound as the first one or something. Do you see what I mean? And
Yeah.
so like that's that dimensional language, but they still maybe had something to contribute that was interesting or thought,
Yeah.
So I think we all, again, myself included, can do better about being mindful of when we're using categorical dimensional language and the political, social, functional, practical, descriptive aspects of those, and what it does that's good and what it does that's not so good, because each has its pros and cons, right?
For sure.
And even as we apply these to ourselves, right, as we think in our own life, oh, did I get this or didn't I get this? Well, that sometimes is helpful, sometimes is really not helpful, and just leads to a lot of comparison and judgment. And sometimes perfectly useful and really helps us and seems to fit with our experience and provides value.
So I guess I kind of wanted to touch a little bit on insight. and how you would define insight, and how are like ordinary or relative insights different from ultimate or fundamental insights?
Right. So I could have the relative insight that there is value in categorical or dimensional language about jhanas, because I myself have been guilty about sometimes using categorical terms or even dimensional terms when maybe that was not that helpful with myself and others. And that's a relative insight. I just learned that from experience. So wait, I could be a little better about this, and hopefully others can as well if they choose to do so. And that's a relative insight. And then from my point of view, at least in the tradition I'm coming from, so this is, again, just one tradition's take on what insight is, and not everybody would agree with this. Like insight is a direct perception of things coming and going, like, which sounds so simple, literally just to hear that snap came and went, or that the sound of that snap arose due to conditions, or that the sound of that snap seemed to be here rather than here in my head, right? Or that the sound of that snap might have had something jarring about it because it changed, and anything that changed slightly jars the mind, or anything that we then are making a dualism out of seems to be somehow jarring. Wait, what is this thing that I'm trying to create as a stable observing entity in a changing sensate world, right? Something about that is jarring, and to just directly perceive those is what we call the three characteristics. This is impermanence, no self, and suffering. And this is just a Buddhist definition of this, and it doesn't have to be anybody else's definition. Other definitions might include an appreciation of just the immediacy of all experiences in a way that seems timeless, because all thoughts of time and past and future are just experienced now. Or a sense of boundary dissolution might be some people's conception of insight. That, wait a second, really, that what I think of as the hard lines between me and not me may not be so hard, right? Or just the sense of agencylessness, that things occur on their own, or the sense of some shift where one moment I was relating to experience one way, and suddenly I'm relating to it in a way like that all of a sudden just seems much better, like because there's less suffering in it. So reductions in suffering from a certain point of view kind of have that insighty feel, where all of a sudden there's more space around my thoughts. I can see my thoughts as thoughts rather than being contracted into them. That has a quality of insight. Or I can really see that, wait a second, these little sensations that I was so freaked out about are just these little sensations changing, here or whatever. And suddenly that kind of perspective is also one of the things we think about as having an insighty component to it, because certain stages of insight involve these perceptual shifts that suddenly can see things more clearly, precisely, in a bigger, broader, more workable, functional context, can notice things about the way the sense of a self is constructed that we didn't notice before. So there's lots of ways to think about insight. And again, this is just one tradition's take on what insight might be. So other traditions might have very useful functional definitions that can help people of how they think about insight. And okay, if that's useful for you, cool.
Yeah, the late great Robert Bia, he in his book Seeing That Freeze, he defined insight as, it's any way of looking that reduces suffering.
Sure, right.
So, yeah. But there's something you mentioned, the three characteristics. Part of insight, at least through the Buddhist lens, is perceiving these three characteristics and perceiving them on a deeper level, and constantly perceiving them and understanding them on a deeper level. I believe that, I think it was you that said it, that basically in all spiritual traditions, whether they call it, the recognition of no self or non-self, or whether they call it suffering or impermanence, in some way, the practitioners are perceiving those things, and their progress is kind of weighing on those three characteristics in some way. Can you speak on that?
Definitely the perennialist in me that also appreciates old school Theravada Buddhism. So again, one dude's opinion on the internet. But when as someone whose pattern recognition skills, I actually think I have pretty good pattern recognition skills. And you learn a lot of pattern recognition skills clinically being an ER doctor, because you have to get good at pattern recognition to diagnose conditions that can present a wide range of ways, but might all be the same thing. Appendicitis, for example, a vexing condition that can present, you think it's going to be right lower quadrant pain that hurts when you move and like makes them not want to eat. But as anybody who's done this long enough recognizes, there are all kinds of other possible presentations of appendicitis that could be very different. It's the pain is in the wrong place, or it's not really pain, or it's just nausea, or they are walking funny and they think it's in their leg or their hip, or like, and you're just like, oh God. But yeah, somewhere pattern recognition has to go, yeah, but this could be an atypical presentation of appendicitis, which is actually the most typical presentations, and so is something that isn't exactly like the textbook says it should be. And so as an ER doctor, I've been kind of trained to broad functional pattern recognition, which is a different and clinical thing where that makes me more likely to include a lot of things in the possibilities of what things are. So just recognize that's my training and conditioning, because to survive as an ER doctor and be a good clinician, you have to do that. You have to keep a wide differential and be thinking about a lot of things that things could be. So you don't just say, oh, I'm sure this is this, it's that, and then oops, it turned out it wasn't, right? Yeah. So hopefully you keep a wide differential, and that training leads to me looking at the maps of insight. So for example, if you looked at the maps of insight in this and just went exclusively by these criteria, you would miss a tremendous amount of stuff that I think of as functionally being like theorizing and passing away or something. And so just recognize that in my definition or way of thinking about insight, I'm coming from a point of view that is pretty broad because of my ER training, and I care more about functional outcomes. And so that combined with my somewhat, is it modern or post? I don't know. My tendency to perennialism, that I think that likely
postmodern.
Yeah, maybe when someone sees a bright white light, I don't see a lot of possible neural pathways that can be, right? Like when someone's limbs are trembling, it's got to be some dopaminergic disinhibition of some center related to some of the muscle control something centers, and like there's only a few, even if this tradition wanted to call it that, and this tradition wanted to call it that, and this tradition wanted to call it that, the neurophysiology person in me is only imagining so many possible ways that could actually go down from a mammalian biological point of view. And so that all of those kind of combined to give me a tendency where I kind of see this as kind of being the same for a lot of traditions, just with some sort of specific different overlays and interpretations, and a little bit of constructivist stuff that may modify it or tweak it various ways that we may think of as better or worse, depending on our frames of value. But that does kind of drive it all towards like, how many ways is a bright white light going to prevent that suddenly makes you want to go tell everybody about your tradition is awesome? Like it's something about that kind of has to be the same. And in the same kind of way, it's very hard for me to imagine from a three characteristics point of view, are people really seeing permanent sensations in their tradition? I don't think so. So I think impermanence is part of this. Are people really never seeing thoughts as thoughts in their meditative tradition? That would amaze me. Are people really never seeing something curious about intentions and mental impressions? Because these are just part of human experience. Really never seeing something in the way the mind, seems to arbitrarily draw boundaries, and the flexibility of that and the ability of that to shift. Are they really never seeing any of that? Are dark nights really all truly particular to their tradition and involve nothing that's common at all that we can agree is some kind of pathway or functional something? Really, like, are the permanent transformations that people say really just did upgrade their consciousness in a way that is now lasting and resilient in the face of emotional changes and the ups and downs of life? Are those really all going to be totally unique to specific religions? That would astound me. It is possible, and I try to keep an open mind as best I can. But from a clinical point of view, I would, in a biological point of view, and even a functional point of view, I would be amazed if there was that much new under the sun, or that people weren't in some ways describing things they had figured out that weren't some of the same things. Just in the same way that the gallbladder is described in, by Galen and in old Arabic texts and in, Chinese medical texts, it's the same gallbladder. Like maybe they had different words for it, but like, is it really all that different? I don't think so. We can debate, what it means from a Chinese traditional medicine energetic point of view. Okay, that's an interesting discussion, but it's the same gallbladder we're talking about. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
So that's where I'm coming from, and that's why I do some of those moves. And so hopefully people can understand why, that's my take. But not everybody likes or is inspired by those kinds of takes. Okay.
For sure. I recognize now that I have to book Daniel for 2 hours minimum, because I know
Sorry,
we're getting
long answers.
Yeah, we're getting a little Yeah, we're getting a little short on time, so I just want to see because I had so many questions and so many things that I wanted to. But I'm thinking where to go. I guess let's go to shadows. I think this is something I'd like to. I'm sure you would enjoy this. So throughout history, there's been many spiritual and meditation teachers that many considered as awakened, and they still manage to act in inappropriate ways. And
Yeah.
it's often purported that the reason why these supposedly awakened beings misbehaved is because they didn't integrate their shadows. So, just kind of from your perspective, how important is shadow work for a person's development, and especially for those on a meditative path? And are there any practices you do to help you integrate your own shadows?
Wow. So obviously shadow work is hugely important. And this kind of stuff comes out of, Jung, right? So,
Yeah.
and he's the one that really put this term on the map. So you should really just check out his stuff, because I'm not going to, in a few minutes, do anything like justice.
Yeah.
Right. So thank you. But the notion of a shadow, those hidden things we don't see about ourselves, is pointed to in countless spiritual things, right? And so like that we had lessons yet to learn, we had insights yet to integrate, we're still going to reap the karma of the things we've done. We're going to be dealing with our societal and governmental and conditioning and our family conditioning and all of that, and those can have some pretty weird effects. We're going to be dealing with our own physiology, with probably some own neurodiversity of all of these things impact the way that we may be behaving in ways that make us different from others, some of which is going to be good, some of which is not. So what do I do for shadow work? I really appreciate the heck out of shifting through and intentionally spending some time in dark night stages, because I actually think they help show you your shadow by shifting through the stages of fear and misery and disgust and desire for deliverance and reobservation. Those are the bands of meditative experience that, from my point of view, are really going to show you what's down there in some not always so nice kind of way. So I actually think moving through the stages of insight intentionally, and actually sometimes and appreciating the fact that those cycles can move through as part of the perspective on things. I think that's important work. I do magical practices where I spend a lot of time thinking about, but what is the desire behind that wish? And what is the desire behind that wish? And what is really the feeling back down into that? And is there a deeper feeling underlying that? And is there really some older story? And is there, so that's an important part of my own magical practice, just in terms of any kind of casting and things. I think loving kindness and other Brahma Viharas practices will show you your shadow, because you attempt to send one feeling towards categories of beings, enemies, and family members, and all of that. You will get to see what actually comes up when you bring their image to mind. So I actually highly recommend the Brahma Viharas. There are all kinds of other cool tips and tricks for this. Internal family systems, I think, is a really neat one that involves lots of cool meditative assumptions kind of all simultaneously together: true self and emptiness and transience, and yet perspective, and yet parts, and yet integration. It's like really interesting how it skillfully puts together a lot of seemingly contradictory points of view into something that actually I think collectively really works as a neat whole. And there are other variants of that. So like that's not the only tradition that does this, right? So, path working, the tree of life, tarot decks, I don't know, pick your favorite interesting way of doing this. There's lots of cool ways, but that we do it is obviously very important. And back to the whole sort of gurus misbehaving thing. I've just been watching the John of God documentary on Netflix. Wow, it's some stuff. Anyway, what I functionally keep in mind is, do not expect competence in one skill or area to necessarily make us good at anything else. So just because we can dissolve our bodies into light doesn't necessarily mean we speak well. Just because, and the analogy I use a lot is of piano players and authors. So piano players and authors both spend a tremendous amount of time hitting keys in precise sequences to convey meanings and create emotional responses and move their audiences of the art that's being created. And so, of course, you would expect great authors to be great pianists and great pianists to be great authors. Well, no, wait, you don't expect that at all, even though it seems like they're basically doing the same thing. In the same way, just because someone is great at getting into advanced meditative states, or is good at seeing impermanence, or good at seeing causality or atemporality, or very clear in their sensate experience, they're necessarily a nice person or know any other real world skill sets, or is going to have fully integrated their shadow, or whatever it is, whatever even that means. I don't even know what to fully integrate one's shadow means, because the shadow seems to have this way of kind of
Never
replicating
ending.
and morphing
Yeah, it's
and
never
being
ending.
this never ending thing. So like even the notion that you could fully integrate that, I'm highly skeptical of, but that's just me. Other people are sure that one could totally eliminate all unskillful residual things. That's actually part of the definition of a Buddha. But anyway, so the traditions disagree, and maybe that kind of language can be inspiring for some. I find it practically unrealistic, but that's just my take on it. Other people would say, oh, it's no, just because you haven't experienced it yet, whatever. You know how these debates go. And so I think functionally doing shadow work and even looking at the ways we conceive of shadow work and its endpoints and what it means and what the shadow is, and having some flexibility about that, because I think even any attempt to categorize the shadow along rigid categories is likely to create some shadow side of something you missed, right? So just be wary of that from a meta perspective point of view. Yeah, so thank you for raising that important topic.
Yeah, I mean, those are some good tools for all the people out there that aren't happy with Daniel's approach. They could go home and do a little of that shadow work.
Right.
With,
or find it somewhere else. Like my way doesn't have to fit with your aesthetics. I totally respect that my take, my language, my interpretations just don't work for plenty of people. Right. My take doesn't have to work for you. Luckily, there is, despite all the crazy and the weirdness out there, there's a lot of amazing spiritual technology out there, psychological technologies, and all kinds of neat things that's being put out there. We have so much you couldn't even read it all or find it all or watch it all in a lifetime anymore, much less practice it all. And so, if you don't like my stuff, I get that, right? There's plenty of valid stuff out there that aesthetically just doesn't work that well for me, but I recognize has tremendous transformative power for other people. So it's interesting. We have a guy named David who was there with Osho, like when the compound was being raided, and has followed him for decades and still a very active member of the community, even if like Osho's aesthetics didn't really work for me. Personally, he found them incredibly transformative. Even as he's a super decent person, and so like, but actually, like if you pick up Osho's little orange book of meditation stuff, it's pretty good stuff. Like, but 100 rolls is not my style, right? And so so if we could all be a little kinder to each other, recognizing that we have our aesthetic preferences that move our hearts and really work for us at various times, and just try to be a little more sensitive to that, I'll work on that as well as best I can. So, yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. So, we're winding down now, so I just want to close up. Yeah, I guess like what's next for you? What are you excited about? You've been doing all these scanner studies and all this, and
the EPRC and emergence benefactors. So at theeprc.org and ebenefactors.org, those are where my time and energy a lot are going into right now, just because I see so many people who have run into the healthcare system or just not had good data about stuff, and it just hasn't gone well. And I feel so bad for my colleagues that just didn't have good options, weren't trained well to handle this stuff. And I feel bad for the patients, and I feel bad for the system. And, meditation, psychedelics, and all this stuff are scaling. We've just got to do better and figure out a way to do something practical that helps people. And so that's where my emphasis and money and time and political capital and all that are going at the moment, and trying to generate very large international teams with very thoughtful people from diverse backgrounds, that can figure out how to come together and do something beautiful. So that's what I'm really excited about these days.
I love it. I'm passionate about mental health and spirituality and bridging the gap between these things. And it seems like there's definitely 50 million floating out around somewhere that can be used to fund this. I just don't know if the people with that money have hit spiritual puberty yet.
Actually, a bunch have. So there's actually a bunch of very, very spiritual people who have reasonable amounts of wealth at the level that could help us with our project in significant and meaningful ways. And we're in the early stages of some of those outreach conversations now.
Yeah, awesome. So if anybody's listening to this who has this kind of money and who wants to, help people going through these difficult experiences, right, and integrating mental health and spirituality, please contribute.
And just recognize none of the money goes to me. So I don't have to work anymore. I was able to retire. So this is all volunteer. But plenty of other people, the academics, the people who have careers, who want to push this stuff forward, the psychotherapists, and all of the other engaged individuals, they do need to eat. And so to give them the time to work on this, I'm very excited to help find them the money so that they can push this project and make it all it can be.
Awesome. Daniel, thanks a lot. Really appreciate you coming on to the Elevating Consciousness podcast. I appreciate your work. It's impacted me a lot, and I really want to share your ideas with as many people as much, because I know that it could impact a lot more people. I feel like you're just at the beginning. A lot of these ideas are just starting to break through. So I want to keep this going.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. This has been really fun, and best wishes to you all in your own practices and finding wisdom that suits your aesthetics and works for you well.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Daniel. All the best.
Oh, you too. Bye.